Hi po and magandang hapon. It's a manic Monday and katatapos lang po ng school ni Benji. So ngayon po naman, ibang school naman tayo. And we do our live streaming po with Young Doctors PH. We are here po to discuss today a very interesting topic and something that we have never done before. And our guest po is not a doctor, but a scientist. And he is actually a molecular biologist. So, excited po tayo because it's the first time that we have done testing po with a molecular biologist and a scientist as our guest. Most of the time, I just do the testing talks. But today, we're joined by somebody na talaga pong testing is one of the things that they do and that the scope pala ho yun ng work ng isang molecular biologist. So there are very few molecular biologists po sa Pilipinas and I was really fortunate to meet one of them who turned out is my inaanak. And I am very fortunate po to be with my inaanak today. He's a distinguished young scientist. And pag-uusapan po natin everything about COVID testing. So, pwede na ho niyong itanong yung antigen. Kasi ako, I can answer your nasal swab at saka yung rapid. Pero hindi ko po alam yung antigen, pooled, saliva, rapid antigen, pooled swabs, lahat po yan. And bakit po mabagal ang testing sa Pilipinas and what we can do from the science viewpoint para po we can hurry up, do more testing, and get our testing results po very quickly. So let's start na po. Rains, let's start because there's a lot of interest in this topic. Because a lot of people have spoken about testing, but very few have had the good opportunity to have a molecular biologist on board. So my name is Dr. Anna York Bondok. I am the convener po of Young Doctors PH, and I also do a Facebook Live on Dr. Anna York Bondok po. Libreng konsulta almost every day. So we're gonna be live po on two venues, Young Doctors PH and Dr. Anna York Bondok. Because batang-bata pa ho si Joshua. So let's start with introducing po our special guest. My name is Dr. Anna York Bondok and we are very, very fortunate to be joined po. Start ko po, no? He is presently a science research specialist at UP Diliman and with the National Institute of Molecular Biology and Biotechnology. He is currently working for the Disease Molecular Biology and Epigenetics Laboratory of Dr. Ray Garcia in UP Diliman. He is also the convener of the Scientists Unite Against COVID-19, the UP Pandemic Response Team. He is also a summa cum laude graduate of the year 2019 of the BS Molecular Biology and Biotechnology course. And currently finished his postgraduate internship in Taiwan last year and Masters of Science student. We are very, very fortunate to be guested, to nabigay po siya ng oras sa atin. He's my inaanak and now I'm interviewing him. Matanda na po ako. And it's my honor and my pleasure to introduce Mr. Joshua Miguel Danak. Hi, Joshua. Kumusta?
Hello
And good
po. Hello po. Good afternoon po.
yes. Thank you for joining us. It's our first time really to have a molecular biologist on board. So,
Opo. No
to
problem po.
everybody, siguro we will need to interview Joshua on a lot of things because marami tayong hindi alam. I'm already a doctor and a lot of this is a mystery to me. So, Joshua, yung simple lang ha na explanation kasi
Mm.
maraming nanonood na hindi doktor. At ako, doktor na. So, the simpler, the better. So, guys, please put your questions below on COVID testing. A lot of people are asking na po in advance. Ilagay nyo lang po below and Miss Reina will read them to Dr. Joshua later on po. To Scientist Joshua later on. So, sige, let's start na. Josh, yung simple lang ha. Nininebs na kayo ng
Opo, opo.
okay. Ayan. So, the question that we got po is from another doctor. So it goes here, Dear Doctora and Molecular Biologist Joshua, I am a general practitioner. And dati, naintindihan ko po yung COVID testing. Because after all, I understood the PCR and the rapid antibody test. Which I know hindi na dapat. Okay? But lately, ang dami-dami na pong lumalabas. Like the antigen testing, pool testing, meron pa hong saliva, at iba't iba pa po. So ang dami-dami na po and I'm getting confused. Two things also, bakit ang bagal-bagal ng mga labas po ng mga test ng mga pasyente ko? Sometimes tapos na po yung quarantine nila, we don't still have the test result. So maybe you can help explain what's with the backlogs. So please help me, Doctora and molecular biologist Joshua. So Joshua, explain muna sa amin, what is a molecular biologist and ano yung role niyo sa testing?
Opo. So, molecular biologists, we are scientists who usually deal with mas very, very basic parts of biology kasi we're not concerned with like yung animals or plants or not even anatomy or physiology, but usually we go straight down to the molecular level. So when it comes to DNA, RNA, proteins, ganun, so things happening inside the cell, usually yun yung realm of a molecular biologist. And so when it comes to diagnostic testing, hindi naman to yung parang super na field na ginagalawan namin. It just so happens that when, for example, ngayon, yung situation is meron tayong novel virus. So that's one of the things that molecular biologists might be knowledgeable in. And because this is what we call an RNA virus, so this virus has genetic material called RNA, and the diagnosis for this, lalo na since bago siya, so we fall back to the standard technique, which is PCR. These are very common place techniques for molecular biologists. So for example, yung RT-PCR that is done to diagnose COVID, it's actually a technique that I learned in undergrad, for example, and I could do it on a daily basis. So I think that's the one of the things we bring to the table when it comes to COVID is that we have a very good technical and practical understanding of how to get these things done. Lalo na in the situation ngayon, na the challenge really for the whole country, it's been the challenge since the beginning, is how do we ramp up or scale up yung PCR testing to the level that is needed since we're dealing with a very severe pandemic.
Yeah. So, basically, undergrad lang pala yung nasal swabby. Okay. So, sabi, malaki na yun. Okay.
Oh,
So, it's
hindi
an
po kami yung
undergrad.
nag-swab, pero kami po yung we would know how to process the swabs.
Can you take us very simply, please, through the PCR and the nasal swabbing? Simple lang,
Um,
ha? Oo.
so usually yung swabs, no, so what, 'di ba, kukuhanan ng swab yung patient either sa nose or sa throat, sa mouth,
Okay.
or sometimes they can even use fluid from the lungs, or saliva or sputum. It's also possible. And then, so yun yung sample collection. And then, this is brought to a lab where, since we're dealing with a highly infectious virus, it has to be a lab that is equipped with the proper level of biosafety. And then, the first, so we have to process this sample. No? So, yung PCR testing process, hindi siya as straightforward as pinapasok sa machine and may result na. So, may konting processing na nagaganap. And usually, this processing is, first you have to inactivate the sample para patayin yung virus that's there
Kasi baka
for
may
your
mahawa.
for your
Oo.
own protection. Yes.
Oo.
And then, once it's inactivated, we do an RNA extraction. So like I mentioned before, kasi the virus has genetic material called RNA, and yun kasi yung pakay natin sa PCR. That's what we want to get. So we have to extract the RNA from the rest of the sample kasi syempre galing yun sa patient, 'di ba? So parang maraming other things doon. And once you extract the RNA, that's when you can do the PCR mismo. So PCR is just a simple, relatively simple technique to
Simple. Okay,
detect
go.
a specific gene or a specific virus, for example, in this case. So once that's done, and you get the results, then dun makakapagsabi whether you're positive or negative for the presence of the SARS-CoV-2 or the COVID virus.
Ayun. So the PCR, ang hinahanap niya, yung RNA ng virus.
Yes,
And
yes.
the virus, that's the antigen, kumbaga.
So yung virus, since it's a virus, it's a piece of RNA or it's a
Oo.
sequence of RNA. So yun yung parang genetic material niya. Yun yung mismong virus. But like all viruses, meron siyang protein coat or protein
Oo.
shell which protects it. And doon kinukuha yung antigens, doon sa outer coating of the
Okay.
virus
These are the
itself.
signals at the end, outer end of the coat. Oo.
Yeah,
So hinahanap nyo basically yung RNA ng virus.
yeah. So yun
Okay.
yung tinatawag na gold standard kasi yun yung most accurate and most precise way that we can actually determine if the virus is present or not.
If you find the RNA of the virus in the sample of the nasal swab.
Yeah.
Ayan. Okay. So yan that's why we do the nasal swabbing to find out if the virus is present. And then bakit do I know it already? Can you explain to us why there's only a time frame? Like not you are not going to get the virus throughout the entire illness of the patient. Paki-explain lang kung
Mhm.
bakit on day 1 to 2 hindi muna dapat. What I explain
Ah.
to people is kailangan dumami muna yung virus. Tama
Ah.
ba yun?
Yeah, actually, so yun kasi yung tinatawag natin na viral load. So, usually, basically lang naman, if masyado pang konti yung virus that's there,
You might
you might miss it, 'di ba? Kasi kuwari, yung mismong PCR, it's actually very sensitive. Like, if even if there's probably as low as a single copy of the virus, mahahanap na yun. But the problem is, yung pag-swab, usually, yun yung dun mas likely na ma-miss. So, for example, kung hindi naman malalim yung pagka-swab or kung konti lang yung pagkakuha ng cells from your throat, then it's more likely that you will miss during the earlier stages, lalo na pag kaka-infect mo
kaka-expose
pa
mo
lang.
pa lang. Oo, like
Yeah,
day 1, ganun. That's
yeah,
what I tell patients. I tell them na sa day 1, nagpapadami pa yung virus. So, baka
yeah,
konti lang yung makuha mo.
yes,
So,
yes.
when is the best time to do the nasal swabbing? Let's say,
So,
inubuhan ako today or I met the patient today na wala akong
mm,
mask. When's the best
mhm.
time for me?
So nagva-vary pa yung recommendations kasi nga we're learning a lot. Pero I think the consensus right now is around 2 to 3 days after the
Mm-mm.
exposure. So we just have to be careful na this means after exposure pero not necessarily na kapag asymptomatic it means hindi ka na dapat iswab. Kasi what we is very clear now in the literature is that um, even if wala ka pang symptoms, so the virus is still incubating, it is very possible for you to be contagious. And in fact, similar lang yung viral load ng asymptomatic and symptomatic patients. So I think that's one misconception out there, is that if wala ka namang nararamdaman or if hindi ka naman umuubo, either hindi ka nakakahawa, or some people suggest na you shouldn't even get tested kasi wala ka pang symptoms. Pero actually, that's a misconception. So we now know that there can be a lot of asymptomatic or pre-symptomatic spread of COVID, and that's actually probably one of the reasons why it became a pandemic.
Yeah. Kasi what I normally tell people is, baka na-encounter mo yung patient ng Monday. By Wednesday ho, nagkakalat na kayo. So, by
Mm-mm.
Friday, doon
Mm.
kayo ubuhin, nilalagnatin. So, between Wednesday to Friday, marami na ho kayong iikutan. That's what I
Yes.
tell people.
Yes.
So, if you know na you met a COVID patient, by Wednesday, dapat pa-test ka na. Kasi meron na makukuha by that time. So, tama ba
Yes.
yun?
Yes.
Oh,
Yes.
thank
Yes.
I don't want to be spreading the wrong news. Okay, question what are the needs? Bakit ang hirap-hirap? And this I think this is more of
Mm.
your knowledge as a scientist
Mm-mm.
rin. Bakit kuminsan, halimbawa kami ay magpa-testing Joshua, kuminsan 10 days na wala pa. And
Mm.
then the second, I think the answer is backlogs, tama ba ako? And
Opo.
then
Opo.
the second question is, what are the needs for us to be able to put up a laboratory? Like, ano ba? Bakit nagkaka-backlogs? Ba't hindi maglagay ng
Opo.
marami? Okay, sige,
Opo.
paki-explain lang how to put up a lab.
Opo. So, siguro pa I'll start by, gaano ba dapat katagal?
Oo.
Actually, the whole process of when you get the swab and then you do the inactivation, the RNA extraction, the PCR, it should be finished within a day. Kung dire-diretsuhin siya, actually, it wouldn't take more than 6 to 8 hours.
Okay.
So, let's say yung day one mo, travel time ng swab to the lab, and then day two yung testing. That's why yung ina-allot lang talaga dapat, or yung on time na kino-consider, is if the swab gets a result within 48 hours
Okay.
after it was collected. So yun yung
Ideally.
target.
Oo.
Yeah, or yun yung ideal. In practice, like you said po, we see na sobrang tagal na nung turnaround time, or sobrang tagal bago magka-results. And the reason is kulang yung testing capacity. So there's simply too many swabs to process. Kaya nagtatambakan. So I remember when I was at the Lung Center, nagkaroon kami ng point na yung backlogs namin umaabot na ng parang 4,000 or 5,000.
Oh my
Tapos,
gosh.
ang napaprocess lang namin per day dahil mababa pa yung capacity was something like 500 or 600. Ayun, dumarating daily, let's say 1,000 na naman. So talagang mag-iipon, di ba? Kasi mas marami yung pumapasok kaysa sa nagawa nyo per day. So what are the reasons? Bakit kulang? Well, when we go to testing, we like to think na there are three parang ingredients that go into it. So the first is you need a lab. So you're gonna need not just any lab in any hospital, pero kailangan nga, like I said earlier, it has to have the appropriate biosafety level, and it has to have the specific equipment na kailangan for PCR. So in this case, we need things like yung PCR machine, kailangan natin ng biosafety cabinets, and syempre, hindi lang isa-isa. Kasi nga, kung marami kang swabs na gagawin, you're gonna need a lot of those. Second is we need materials, the supplies for the test. So what we hear usually in the news is that ginagamitan ng test kits or ng PCR test kits. But actually yung test kits, they're only parang ano lang yan, final ingredient lang yan in the whole recipe. Kasi you will also need a lot of other lab supplies. Like for example, we have what we call yung RNA extraction kits. We also have what we call the filtered tips for the micropipettes in the lab, yung mga PCR plates, and so on. So parang maraming accessories, maraming consumables that na kailangan na lab supplies. And then syempre kailangan ng PPE para dun sa mga gagawa ng test, yung medtechs, or yeah, and so on. So you need a lab, and you will also need a lot of supplies, not just the test kits. And then finally, of course, you will need people who are
Yung
trained
marunong gumawa.
to
Oo.
actually do the PCR. Yeah, and in the Philippines kasi hindi pa standard na training sa medtechs yung molecular diagnostics or yung PCR. So not everyone knows yet
What
how
to
to
do?
do it. Lalo na yung challenge of doing it at scale if you're receiving a
Sobrang
lot of
dami.
swabs. Yeah. So yun yung things that are needed if you want to set up your COVID testing laboratory. And the reason that we are facing a lot of backlogs basically is because kulang yung things na yon. So for example, there in the beginning lalo na walang lab na nagte-test. Pinapadala yung samples sa Australia. And then for a long time it was just RITM
RITM.
for the whole country. And then nung nag-start sila mag-activate ng laboratories, uh, meron lang silang parang six or so other laboratories. Ngayon, nakita natin na this has been addressed in the sense na dumami na yung laboratories, but the problem now has shifted to a problem of allocation because out of all the COVID testing laboratories now in the country, I believe around half or so are actually private labs. And the difference is kapag private labs, syempre, since private sila, they will just take yung samples of whoever, yung parang sinong clients nila or sinong patients nila, sino nagpa-test sa kanila. Yung sa public labs though, lalo na yung mga dinedesignate na subnational labs ng RITM, they're the ones na kailangan sumalo nung marami ring demand. So, it's become a problem of that allocation na yung public labs, sila yung natatambakan ng samples ko galing sa LGU, galing sa community, galing sa mismong patients sila, and then referrals from other hospitals. And syempre, sila yung parang mas poorly positioned to address that disparity in the allocation. So that's one problem. And then syempre, the price din kasi is a factor, right? So mas mura kasi yun or probably free.
So
So
everybody's
sila,
there.
yeah. And sadly, yun yung naging isang factor ngayon which why testing is becoming it's necessary now for a lot of things, lalo na yung mga magta-travel or and so on. I heard even the licensure exams are gonna require a PCR test, right? But sadly,
Bakit naman? Oh, okay.
uh,
No. All of that is beyond me. Okay, sige,
oo
go.
nga po eh, yeah. But so sadly, there are these things that are gonna generate a lot of demand, and then yung choices mo lang are either a public lab that is nalulunod sa backlog, so matagal ang result, or if you have the
Or
money, you
pay
pay
more
through
for
the
the private
notes.
lab.
Yeah, so because sometimes reaches like 10,000, right, 12,000. So it's very financially inaccessible for a lot of Filipinos. So that's for the labs. And then the other things I mentioned, like yung supplies, for
Consumable.
example, yeah, we actually have that's actually one of our biggest problems is hindi na secure yung supply chains of those materials in the country. So it's not totally our fault naman kasi there's intense global competition. So a lot of these supplies are short talaga. But
Saan
despite
galing
that,
yung mga consumables natin?
yeah,
What countries all over the
Apo.
world?
Apo.
Ganun.
So for reference, wala tayong pinoproduce domestically doon,
Not
halos.
even one.
Yeah, not even the simple plastic tips or plates, So we have to import everything and uh, sadly, hindi pa secure yung supply chain. So oftentimes, if narinig sa news na, for example, this lab nag-scale down or
Kulang na
mag-stop
yung
muna
gamit
daw,
niya.
yeah,
Oo.
kasi naubusan na ng gamit. So even if, for example, meron ba akong 1,000 test kits, if naubusan naman ako ng something else, like yung PCR plates or yung filter tips, I still won't be able to do the test. So this is why we actually hope na everyone, the people, the officials, everyone should realize na the PCR testing is not just the PCR test kit. There's actually a lot of
Marami pang ibang
supplies
gamit. Oo.
that needs
Na
to go into
kailangan.
it. So, kailangan, di ba, parang from an operations perspective, if you're gonna manage this
Lahat yun
whole,
available.
yeah, you have to think about your logistics for all of that. Meron ba akong supply nung lahat nung kailangan?
At
And
lahat
then,
yun imported.
yep, yep. And then, with regards naman sa people, so as usual, I think this is a common problem naman, not just in the laboratory. as we've seen lately. Pero kulang din ng healthcare workers for the lab. So kulang din tayo ng medtechs, kulang tayo ng lab technicians, ganun. And hopefully, if makakapag-hire ng additional, say,
We
medtechs,
need
and
to
kasi,
hire more
yeah,
medtechs.
actually, the training, it's not even a bigger issue eh. Kasi kaya naman yun ituro within the lab. It's really more of kulang talaga yung tao in the first place.
Okay. So lahat yon combined together will create
Mhm.
backlogs. At yun ang
Yes.
nangyayari. Okay.
Yes.
Hindi kaya dapat na we should stop PCR testing yung mga nakaisip lang? And that there should... Anyway, sa iba na yon, that's operations already, and who should be PCR tested and who should not be tested. Kasi otherwise, makaklog up yung labs ng mga hindi dapat i-test. Ayun.
Yeah.
So, yun yung PCR testing. So, wait, let's ano lang muna ha. Ngayon ko lang nalaman lahat to. So, a PCR test would actually be able to come out within a day. So that you
Yeah.
know whether you need to be quarantined or not.
Yes.
And
Yes.
if you need to go to the quarantine facility or hindi. But because of the backlogs, because of the lack of consumables, lack of lab, and lack of trained medtechs, umaabot na natapos na yung quarantine mo bago lumabas yung test mo.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Yan. So sige, this is really super interesting. What is even, sige, tinapos na natin yung PCR. Are there cases na mali yung PCR? Yun.
So
Oo, kasi we also asking bakit kuminsan and bakit 14 days yung sinasabi nila and how come some people still have positive PCRs after a long time?
So PCR, it's actually the best test that we have. And if mali man yung test result, the most likely reason would be, like I mentioned earlier, if we get a
Baka wrong
false
timing.
negative, not from the PCR but probably swabbing.
Okay, the swabbing.
If you do it early, you're na magka-false negative. But
Or the
for
wrong
example,
timing.
false positives, yeah, not the false positives are super super unlikely kasi the tests that we use, the PCRs that we use are actually highly specific. So actually kaya siya gold standard eh. Parang by definition siya yung magsasabi kung may COVID ka
Talagang
or
pag
wala.
positive ka, talagang more or less talagang positive ka na talaga. Okay. How about those people na matagal na pero positive pa rin? What is the meaning of that? Or meron bang, should that be
Mhm.
answered by the scientist
So
or by
actually,
the... Oo.
so what we know now is that even after matapos kasi yung 14 days, it's possible na there's still remnants or bits and
Ayun
pieces,
na nga.
kumbaga, of the virus
Yeah.
that are left pa in your body. But the most crucial for us is that we know na by the 9th or 10th day of illness, the patient is no longer contagious. So this is
Ayun.
why meron na ngayong 14, yung
Bubble.
rule is that,
Yeah, 14 days. Oo.
yeah, if you finish the 14-day quarantine and you're already wala ka ng symptoms, ganun, you're clinically recovered, you can be considered non-contagious na. So you can be sent home. So that's important kasi it will free up capacity
Imbes na
in the,
dalawang swabbing, pwedeng isa na lang and then 14
yeah,
days. As yun yung
yeah,
bagong lumabas. Okay.
yeah. And
As a
actually,
doctor, sige.
actually po, we hopefully that can be leveraged kasi right now an extra source of PCR demand kasi yon yung mga sineswab para mag-negative na daw, pero you don't actually need, yeah, you
Hindi
don't
na.
actually need that swab anymore. So dapat
Yes,
yung sineswab na lang yung mga kailangan nating malaman if they're positive or not.
Okay. So the second swab, time na lang. Wala
Yes.
nang second swab, time na lang. Okay.
Yes.
Time na lang after 14 days. As a doctor, I always hear the term remnants. Ano yung meaning ng remnants? And number two is, paano mo alam na hindi nakakahawa yung remnants? Kasi I always tell people, ma'am, pag may remnants na ho, patay na ho yun at hindi nakakahawa. But I don't know the details kung bakit siya remnant. Yun.
So it's actually it's a bit technical. But basically kasi the remnants probably come from for example, so for example the virus has infected your respiratory tract. So it's
Uh-huh.
replicating in your throat or in your lung, and then we know that eventually this will be cleared by the immune system. So this will be the macrophages or the T cells, the killer T cells, whatever. Maraming immune system cells that will come in and they will basically kill the virus or they will kill the virus infected cells. And then somewhere along the way, pag pinapatay na yung virus, dun na-generate most likely yung remnants. Kasi it's not, hindi naman siya parang perfect process na pag nawala yung virus, it will disappear. Siyempre, it's possible na may matira.
May naiiwan ng mga parts, kumbaga.
Yeah,
Oo.
yeah. But the important question is how if these are the real the live virus? Kasi di natin yun malalaman from a PCR alone. So this is something that has been determined by other studies. So what they would do is, for example, is to swab yung patient every day. And then from the swab, aside from doing the PCR, they will also try in their own lab to culture the virus. They will try to see kung may
Kung
virus pa ba
buhay
na
pa siya.
mabubuhay from that
Oo.
swab. Yeah, so that's actually how they were able to say na after 10 days, yung nag-detect sa PCR mo, remnants na lang yan. Wala nang live virus. And that's something that's
Yeah.
been replicated consistently in the past few months na by the time na ganitong 9 or 10 days, wala na talaga. Which is why nag-revise na ng guidelines from WHO and from all the regulatory agencies na we can do yung time-based or symptom-based recovery.
Para isang swab na lang yung tao. And that is at
Yeah.
the beginning. That is at the beginning. Ang ganda nun. At least alam ko hindi ako nagkakalat ng mali. Kasi nakakaiya. Okay?
Yeah.
Ayun. Sa book pa, nagkakalat ako ng mali. Miss Reina, is it okay if we check for any questions, Joshua? Kasi ako, I'm finding this so fascinating. Oo.
Sure po.
Okay, from Sarina. Hello, Doc. Good afternoon po. Ayan, ito na ang this is the next question. Mabuti bringing up ito ni Sarina. Thank you, Sarina. Hello, Doc. Good afternoon po. And ask ko lang po if merong guidelines or protocols na po for rapid antigen testing. And please
Yeah.
tell us what is rapid antigen testing or antigen testing. Yan.
Yeah. So the antigen, it actually refers to a part of the virus. So like we mentioned earlier, but the virus is basically yung RNA or yung genes niya, yung genetic material niya is the protein parts of the virus usually. Sila yung other parts aside from the RNA. So antigen tests like PCR, it means that they will also directly look for the virus itself. But the difference is that PCR is way more accurate and way more reliable. So yung antigen tests that are available now, they are not yet completely validated for accuracy. So it's still very possible that they will give false negatives or false positives. And the question is there already a protocol? We're actually waiting for DOH to issue their own guidelines on rapid antigen testing. So merong antigen tests that are approved by the FDA, pero that approval kasi is it's basically just an authorization. In terms of field validation, kung gaano ba ka-accurate yung test, that is gonna vary from brand to brand and wala pang guidelines or protocols that have been issued as of now.
So right now, we're waiting for the guidelines of the DOH.
Yes po. So di kasi natin
Bakit
sila
mas
pwedeng
mabilis?
pangunahan.
Okay. Oo naman. Question, bakit rapid ang pangalan niya rin? What is faster about it versus the PCR? Mabilis ba siya talaga?
Yung rapid, yeah, they're supposed to be mabilis rin na probably under 1 hour or so.
Okay.
But like a PCR, dapat swab pa rin. Dapat swab pa rin yung gamit. But then instead of going through the whole process kasi ano lang, parang probably meron lang yung solution or something and then i-dip lang or gano'n. Mabilis lang talaga yung process niya. But the trade-off of being rapid is that it's not very reliable. And for perspective, usually, like historically, it takes us several years to develop rapid tests that are reliable enough. So, syempre ngayon, sa COVID, nagmamadali lahat, pero we expect na itong mga first generation rapid tests na lumalabas, they're not yet reliable enough. So we would have to wait for data that would say whether or not these rapid tests are reliable to be used.
Okay. So wala pa. Okay. So yan. So it detects the antigen around the coating, not necessarily the RNA of the virus. Yan. Tama ba ako?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay.
Apa.
Good. Yan. Mimi, doktora, magkaka-cancer daw po ang mask. Parang hindi po, ma'am. Magkaka-COVID ang walang mask. Yun ang sasabihin ko sa'yo. Okay? Ano po ang first aid solution sa COVID? Ma'am, my best suggestion for COVID is isolation and quarantine. Yun po talaga. And then if you become symptomatic, then that's the time po that you need to have to go to the hospital, go to the ER, and hindi na po si Joshua ang magbabahala sa inyo. Kami na, mga pulmo.
Apa.
Okay, you don't want that to happen. Ayaw natin yan, okay? So, sige po. And then we start to go into the more difficult issues po of oxygenation. From Jeffrey Guevara, totoo po ba sa pangolin nakuha yung virus? Kung hindi naman po, ay may pag-aaral po kung saan nagsimula or saan nagkalat. Basically, the origin, as a molecular biologist, can you answer
Yeah.
this? I don't
Yeah.
know. Oo.
Yeah. So actually we are very confident that the original virus, like the other coronavirus, yung SARS na nauna, probably came from a bat or
Oo.
panike,
Yep.
So kasi we know this kasi we can compare yung genetic sequences of the human coronavirus. Yung pangolin, it's one of the theories kasi yung most likely it didn't come direct from a bat, pero dumaan siya sa another animal. So from a bat, it could be a pangolin na nasa gitna, but we don't know yet for sure. What we do know for sure is that this virus is not artificial, or it wasn't made in a lab. It wasn't deliberately designed to infect people. I'd like to clear yung ganun kasi maraming
Ay,
ganong
maganda
fake
yan
news
kasi
na
people keep
kumakalat na.
asking me this. Oo. So from the
Yeah,
RNA and
na was
studies
this
in science,
man-made?
it
Yeah,
really means it's
yeah.
really a zoonotic virus.
Yeah, so zoonotic, it jumped from an animal to a human. So we know this kasi masyado siyang close to the animal virus, which has been there. Syempre natural 'yon. So there's no way that this was actually, made by a human.
Magandang that's something that people keep asking me also. So I'm really grateful to hear it from you. Um, Dr. Joshua, question uli. What is pooled testing naman?
So pooled
Joshua,
testing,
what is pooled testing? Yes.
pooled testing is one of the proposed strategies to improve yung PCRs natin. The idea is, for example, magsaswab ng 5 different people, pero i-run yung PCR nila isa lang. So pag masign yung sample nila. And yung logic doon is kasi kapag kuwari nag-combine ng multiple samples and nag-negative yung combined na yon, it means na negative lahat. So it's a strategy to reduce the number of tests na kailangan gawin. Kasi for example, you want to test 100 people. If you test na sila individually, you need to do 100 tests.
Yes. Oo.
Yeah. Pero let's say i-combine mo sila in pools of 5. So you can do 20 tests at first, yung groups of 5 mo, and then pag may nag-negative, sure ka na agad na negative yung 5 na yun. Kapag may nag-positive, doon mo lang iisa-isahin yung individual samples dun sa nag-positive to find out sino yung positive sa pool na yun. So it's an attractive strategy kasi it reduces the costs, but we have to point out yung limitations, which is specifically uh, it only works kung konti lang yung positive in the first place. Actually, the suggestion is something like 5% or 2% lang in overall yung positive. Kasi maraming negative, so madali lang mag-clear na kapag negative to,
Ah,
negative lahat.
pasado, ganon.
It's efficient. But if marami ring positive, magpa-positive lang din halos lahat nung pools mo. So which is why I think now there are proposals to implement pool testing in the country, but we have to be careful about how to implement this kasi, for example, our data now suggests that yung positivity rate natin is actually very high. It's around 10% or higher. So in that scenario, it wouldn't be cost effective to do pool
Kasi
testing. And then
uulit-ulitin mo lang yung mga tests kasi may mga
yep,
positive, ganon.
yep.
Bawat
And then
batch may mga
yeah. Something I want to point out then is sa lab, it's actually not as simple as combining the swabs. Kasi for example, that will add an extra step in your PCR workflow na after extracting the RNA, instead of going straight to the PCR, kailangan nyo pa i-combine yung samples. So that means you will need extra time and you will need extra supplies and probably extra equipment, extra people. So it's not merong cost savings PCR, pero meron fifth. Also might it's also liable to increase yung turnaround time even kasi imagine for example para maka-complete ka ng isang PCR run, normally you would need 96 samples. Pero kung pooled testing yan lahat, something times 5 kasi nagpo-pool ka pa. So pwedeng lalong tumagal, and then kapag nag-positive, dun ka pa lang i-follow up na i-test individually. So it's not as straightforward as if we pool the tests, our life will be easier. Parang ganun. It's not as simple as that.
And if we are testing symptomatic persons, edi talagang higher than 10% yun kasi talagang malaki na yung feeling natin na may COVID yung taong yun eh.
Yep. Exactly.
Oo, hindi lang naman na we just found them. Oo, if you are getting someone who is highly symptomatic, 20 of them, and you test them together, you will get 20 positives. Kasi clinically, may COVID na sila.
Yeah.
So, talagang hindi lang sila yung nahanap na walang nararamdaman. Ito yung mga na-expose kasi these are the ones we're testing, right?
Yeah.
If people are exposed and with symptoms, so yung probability ng positive test sa kanila mataas talaga.
Yeah.
Yun.
So it's really not advisable in those situations.
Okay. So, yon. So, it remains to be seen if that's going to be helpful. Hindi natin masasabing for sure. Okay. Lalo na kung marami tayong positives. Yun.
Yeah.
At kung kulang na rin yung supplies natin.
Yeah, exactly. I think for us yun yung bigger concern na hindi na masyadong nabibigyan pansin is that like I said kanina no, you can imagine a lot of labs, very difficult ang situation nila ngayon. Kasi kulang sila sa tao, kulang sila sa supplies, ganun. And then magdadagdag ka ng something like, oh, you have to do food testing. Just like for example, if i-combine mo yung swabs, kailangan mo ng inventory system to track si patient ganito, anong pool siya na ganun. And then kailangan mo ng system para pagbalikan yun. In most of the labs, lalo na yung public labs, manual pa rin halos lahat. You know, daming paper, 'di ba? Paper ang CIF, paper ang pagsulat ng results. So you would need way more than just the idea of
wala silang barcoding.
You're gonna need a lot of Not even, not all, not all.
What? Ako,
Yeah,
what do
and a
you
lot
mga
like
sabihin mo?
when na
Barcoding. Oo.
naranasan ko na yung samples naka-number pa yan, like nasa 10,000 na kaya ganyan, 12,000. Marker pa talaga yan. So it's not as simple as may idea tayo ng food testing we can implement. We really have to think hard about the logistics on the ground.
Pag-isipan ng mabuti. At bumili
Yeah.
ng barcoding, okay?
Yeah.
From his kailangan niya, okay? Ako na lang yung sarili kong tindahan. Gusto ko i-barcode, nakalit-lit namin. Okay, so for Miss Marife, saan po, this is very nice. Antigen versus antibody testing. Kasi I always explain this. From a scientist point of view, give us the
Mhm.
antigen versus the antibody. Yan.
So like we mentioned earlier, the antigen is a part of the virus. The antibody is what your body makes or what your immune system makes to recognize the antigen. So yung antibody panghanap yan ng antigen. And the difference, it's a big difference, no? Kasi yung antigen, virus yan mismo. But yung antibody, yun lang yung response ng katawan mo. And crucially, we've discovered na for COVID, it takes your body about 2 to 3 weeks to actually make enough antibodies to be detected by a test. So bakit yun important? Kasi syempre kung 2 weeks pa lalabas yung antibody, by that time, tapos na yung quarantine. Yeah. So this is why
Trying to tell people.
the easy way to remember is if it's PCR or if it's a viral test, you're looking for present infections. You're looking for active infections. Kasi yung tanong na sinasagot mo is, do you have the virus or not? But if it's an antibody test, it can only really look for past infections. It's very bad at diagnosing a current infection. And syempre tayo, ang concern natin most of the time is, may COVID ka ba ngayon or not?
Ay,
Kasi kailangan
nakakaawa
nating,
ba itong
yeah,
kaharap ko?
malaman, are
Ayan.
you contagious or not? Can you infect me
That's
or
the
not?
number
And
one
then
question. Yes.
an antibody test cannot really answer that kasi it doesn't look for the virus. It just looks for your body's antibodies. So it doesn't make sense to screen people, for example, na antibody test ang gamit, even if kahit nga hindi rapid test kahit yung mga CLIA tests or ELISA tests, they're still antibody tests. So it doesn't make sense to use them. For example, I've heard stories of people na para daw makauwi sa probinsya nila, kailangan ng rapid test, ganun. So that's a big no-no. Kasi nga, it can only tell at best if nagka-COVID ka na before or at least 2 weeks before. Won't tell you if you have COVID right now.
So, i-clear ko lang kasi marami rin nagtatanong. What's ECLIA and what's ELISA? Yan, para lang ano.
So kasi yung antibody tests natin, they can be yung rapid, yung mukhang pregnancy test. So yun yung parang pinprick lang and then parang mabilis lang. But those
Yes or
are
no ang sagot
yeah,
doon, 'di ba?
those are very unreliable kasi
Super.
yeah, papel-papel lang siya. So parang first generation yan ng tests na lumabas. And then nung vinalidate in the field, they weren't actually very good. But yung ELISA or ECLIA, these are things that are actually lab-based. So may machines na yan, meron ng ginagawa sa samples na yan, may process din siya, parang yung sa PCR. It's not as complicated, but it is more reliable. But again, if it's an antibody test, then it will be a reliable way of testing for antibodies, not for the virus. So it can tell you probably if nagka-COVID ka na ba before, but that's not very useful information. Can only you will still need to do a PCR or something like that, a gene expert ganun, to tell you if you have the virus now.
Okay, so malinaw yung antigen, yun yung sa unahan ng infeksyon. And
Yes.
that can tell you kung meron kang COVID today. Ayan.
Yes.
Pero yung antibody will only tell you if you were infected long ago. Ayan. Sir Joshua, ipasok niyo lang po. Ayan, bumalik po si Sir Joshua. Thank you. So, very nice to talk to a scientist. At least I know I'm not spreading misinformation. My God, ang laking bagay ito sa akin. So, if I only knew my inaanak was an expert, ang tagal na kitang tinawagan. But I'm happy to speak to you today. Okay, so Eclia and Eliza are forms of antibody tests.
Yeah.
Tama? And they might
Yeah.
be quite good, but they still are not a screening test kung nakakahawa
Yes.
ka sa araw na to. Okay?
Exactly.
Hindi siya talaga screening. Kahit napaka ganda na daw ng antibody, hindi pa rin siya screening. Okay.
Yeah.
So, um, eto, from Mr. Angelito. Anong gene fragment ang normal na target ng mga RT-PCR test kits na ginagamit sa mga public testing centers? Ayan.
So it varies depending on what test kit they use. Pero the most common that I've seen is it can be what we call the N gene or the nucleocapsid gene of the virus. So these are just yung genes ng virus. No? Another common target is the RDRP or the polymerase of the virus, or this is also called yung ORF1AB. Another target na less common, I think, is yung E or yung envelope gene. So for PCR kasi naman talaga, it's not so important what the target is as long as na-validate yan na gumagana talaga yung PCR, na maganda yung pagka-design ng PCR test kit. And of course, bago ni-release to the market yung ganyang products, those are already highly validated in a lab na they actually detect those genes.
Okay. So, one question, sorry before we take another question. Nabanggit mo yung Gene Expert. Ano yon? Is that a brand?
So Gene Expert is actually I forgot the I'm not sure what company it came from, pero it's basically a rapid form of PCR, or ina-adapt niya yung PCR to work usually in resource limited settings. And it's not actually new kasi matagal na tayong may Gene Expert, and we use it for the diagnosis of TB, for testing for tuberculosis.
Yes,
So
narinig ko na rin yan. Oh.
nung nagkaroon ng COVID, yung manufacturer ng Gene Expert, they quickly produced a Gene Expert test for COVID, and then some of the labs dito sa Pilipinas na dati nagte-test for TB, ngayon, meron na silang cartridges nun, so they can also test for COVID. And the advantage is that it's basically a PCR, so it's reliable, pero dahil nga Gene Expert yung format niya, mas mabilis siya. So makukuha mo agad yung results. And you don't need to set up a whole new lab. Kasi nga marami ng Gene Expert labs dito. Ang trade-off lang is yung Gene Expert, of course, unang-unang limited yung supplies natin ng Gene Expert cartridges. And pangalawa, it's not as high in the throughput as a PCR. So yung Gene Expert, you can only do a limited number of tests per day compared to a PCR.
So, merong PCR at merong rapid PCR. At yun yung
Yeah.
tinatawag ng expert. Okay.
Mhm.
Bakit siya rapid? Does it go through certain steps faster?
Yeah.
Ganun ba?
So meron siyang modifications to the whole workflow, to the whole PCR process para hindi na kailangan yung ganun. For example, I think you don't really need to do an RNA extraction anymore. Parang after the swab, diretso na yun sa Gene Expert cartridge. So
If
it's very important technology, it's very advanced technology. And the downside is, for example, it can only work with a Gene Expert machine.
Sige, is it as reliable as the long PCR
Yeah,
process?
yeah. As far as we know, since same lang naman sila ng PCR parang kinompact lang yung technology. So we still consider it as reliable as PCR. Kasi
Meron naman,
yeah, they
sige,
both look for the viral RNA.
meron na ba tayong government na gumagawa ng rapid PCR? that you
What
know
do you mean?
or na,
Nag
do we have a government lab that does do all
meron
our
po.
government labs do the
Meron
standard
po.
PCR or meron na bang
Some
shorter?
some of them have yung normal PCR, some of them have gene expert, some of them actually have both. So it depends ano yung available sa kanila. But then again, yung limiting factor talaga is yung supply. Kasi yung gene expert, isa lang yung gumagawa nun. So pinag-aagawan din siya ng
Nagkakagulo
like
din.
along around the world talaga.
Oo naman. Yes. Okay. From Olive, rapid tests are not reliable. Why is it being used just for business? Well, ako na lang ang sasagot noon, Ma'am Olive. Um, Huwag na natin sagutin. Sinabi ko na yun eh. Through the viral video. I don't want to speculate. I'm just hoping that people were misinformed. Okay? Kung hindi pa sila na-inform, I'm informing you. Okay? Ban rapid antibody serology testing for the diagnosis po of acute COVID. And kung gusto niyo hong sagutin yung tanong na nakakahawa ba yung taong kaharap ko ngayon, hindi po rapid antibody test ang kailangan yung gawin. Well, the motivation behind that, ayoko na pong sabihin, ayoko na pong isipin kasi hindi po maganda. Okay? And we're not here to discuss the politics because that could take us 5 hours. But thank you for asking. Thank you for asking kasi lininaw na rin po and mahirap talaga to find out the motivations and sana the least harmful na lang po is misinformation. Ngayon, very sad po kung alam nyo ng mali at ginagawa nyo pa rin. Yan ang talagang super sad na po talaga. Okay? And again, the DOH has come out with an advisory. Pwede nyo po, if someone is forcing you to take a rapid antibody serology test to screen, pakita nyo na lang po yung DOH. And then the DTI also, si Secretary Lopez has come out with something also. I'm trying to get the DILG to do something similar. Okay? Thank you for again for asking. From Elaine, repeat PCR test usually still gives a positive test. Would you advise doing a rapid swab for repeat when the patient is already recovering? Sa akin po, this is a clinical question. Ikaw, ano?
Yeah, I think ito po yung na touch on natin earlier na you don't need to do a second swab. You don't need to do a repeat PCR kasi nga it's already been established na yung criteria natin to determine if nakakahawa pa yung patient or not. It's just yung time from the onset of illness.
If you opt to go for a... Ma'am, ang question ko sa'yo, Ma'am Elaine, bakit gusto mong gumawa ng rapid as your second test? Ano yung gusto mong sagutin? Kasi there is no need for a second test whether it be a rapid or a nasal swab PCR. Tama ba ako, Joshua?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
there is no need. As long as the patient looks well, nakalagay naman po, from mild to moderate, pwede na po yung test and time-based strategy. Ngayon ho, kung natubo po yung pasyente sa ICU, ibang usapan po yon and maybe you need to coordinate that po with the person's pulmonologist. Kasi po, kung sobrang grabe po yung nangyari sa tao, the time and test-based strategy is not really the best strategy for that person. Like, halimbawa, nasa ICU pa siya after 14 days, ibang issue po yun.
Yeah.
Okay?
Yeah.
Ibang issue po yun. I would just like to clear that up. And anyway, that person cannot go to work. Again, if the person is pregnant, with cancer, transplant patient, at talagang grabe ho yung sakit, you need to clear it up with a doctor. So, yun po yun. Okay? I think that's more of a clinical question. So from Mark, hello Doc and Sir, ask ko lang po, how do we distinguish if it's man-made or coming from animals or other creatures ang virus? Magandang tanong yan.
So actually
Ulitin mo na lang, oo Joshua.
the way that we distinguish this is tinitingnan natin yung sequence of the virus or yung mismong genes niya, yung mismong genetic code niya. And we compare this to the known sequences. So for example, kaya natin nasabi na natural siya and nanggaling siya from a different animal na nanggaling from a bat ultimately kasi nung kinompare natin yung sequences, nakita natin na yung SARS-CoV-2 in humans is actually closely related, very, very similar dun sa bat coronaviruses. Kaya natin alam na it's natural. How would we know if it was man-made? Actually, there would definitely be telltale signs. Kasi, for example, this is one of the things we do as molecular biologists is genetic manipulation. So, for example, you try to fuse genes together, ganon, you try to edit genes, and that will most likely leave, parang may evidence yan if it was artificially manipulated. There would be telltale signs na, parang ito, bakit to galing sa
May
ibang,
nangyari.
yeah, may nangyari dito na this is not natural. But the fact that we can trace it back to an animal source tells us almost certainly na alam na natin saan nanggaling yan. So actually, one of the things that is important for researchers right now is they're trying to determine nga ano yung parang immediate source, what from bat to what animal, and then from humans. So if they find an animal na ito yung SARS-CoV-2 kamukha lang, that they will know na doon siya galing. But for sure, we know that this virus evolved in nature. It wasn't made in a laboratory.
Zoonotic ang term, ano?
Yeah.
Zoonotic. Okay. From animals. Okay, from Miss Marilyn. Um, how accurate is the rapid swab test? So I guess what she's, ma'am, may dalawang rapid swab tama? Rapid antigen and rapid PCR. Tama ba ako? Ano, Joshua? Yes.
Yeah.
So, yes, please tell us about the accuracy of both. And pricing, alam mo ba? I don't know.
Yeah, yung pricing din ba, I wouldn't be sure kasi for sure iba-iba yan per
Kasi
kung
depende sa
private,
bawat lab. Oo.
yeah, kung private, kung public, kung anong brand ganun. But again, so yung kung gene expert or yung rapid PCR, gene expert is very accurate. It's basically the same as PCR. So you can treat it as the gold standard. But if it's a rapid antigen test, which is also a swab, that's not again hindi pa natin alam kung gaano sila ka-accurate. Hindi pa sila field validated. So I think that's the same reason na we're waiting for DOH to actually release the guidelines. Kasi wala pang nag-test niyan sa actual patients para sa i-check kung accurate ba talaga. And until may gumawa noon or until makita natin yung data na yun, that's when we can say how accurate it is. But for now, we know historically na syempre, mas accurate pa rin ang PCR. So ang rapid antigen tests, since it's a rapid test format, it's still prone to false negatives or false positives. And basically the reason, syempre it's a very technical discussion, pero just think of it as it's way easier kasi to do a PCR to detect RNA. Kasi ang RNA, dire-diretso lang di ba? Same lang.
Mas madali.
It's much simpler. Yeah. It's much simpler to do an accurate PCR than it is to detect an antigen because antigens are proteins, basically. So, they can be very, very complex ang structure and subsequently, mas complicated na yung detection.
Mas
So,
madali mag-detect ng PCR.
yeah, it's way easier to detect the genetic material or the RNA compared to designing and making a test for a protein.
Question, meron bang non-rapid PCR? Non-rapid antigen. In other words, mabagal na antigen test.
Well, there are actually just like yung antibody testing. So, merong rapid yeah, and then merong ELISA format.
Yeah,
or
meron mga
yeah,
ELISA and ELISA for antigens.
Yep. So, and again, probably it's the same, no, na kapag rapid antigen test, that is very faster pero less reliable, whereas yung sa lab mas reliable. But again, the difference is usually kapag may antigen test na na-develop na maganda, yun yung screening test. And then kailangan mo pa rin ng confirmatory test, which should be your PCR na talagang sure ka doon. And then
sige.
May message ako kasi so kapag po rapid antibody test or kapag antibody test, blood ang kinukuha. Kasi ang antibodies nasa blood. But if it's an antigen test or if it's a PCR, that's gonna be a swab. So
ano naman
if
yung saliva test? Oo.
So saliva, actually ano lang yun, same, it's just a different sample. Kasi may nakaisip na can we try instead of taking a swab, kasi in some places na uubusan sila ng swabs. So pwede bang saliva na lang? Kasi dapat may virus pa rin. So actually as early as March, this was already explored in other countries. And they were able to find na saliva can work just as well. So you don't always have to swab. And I think, for example, it's Hong Kong yata na yung incoming travelers nila. Pini-PCR yan, pero saliva lang yung sample.
Laway na
So,
lang. No?
yeah, sila lang mismo dudura. You don't even need a medtech to come and take the swab. So it's a very good strategy, no? Sana to minimize yung resource use natin. Kasi syempre swab, that's a different material na naman na kailangan. And this has
Yeah,
actually
kaya
been brought,
i-travel ka doon sa
yeah,
swab. Oh.
this was brought to the attention na of DOH as early as March or April. And yung last na narinig namin is that pinag-aaralan daw. So, it's already been validated in other countries. Hopefully, it's something that we can
So
also
it
do
could
here.
be
Kasi,
something interesting pwede
yeah,
dito.
we
Oh.
don't need to adjust yung PCR eh. Hindi parang yung pool testing na kailangan mo mag-isip ng paano mo gagawin yung pooling ng PCR. Hindi eh, nagbago lang yung sample. Actually, ngayon pa lang naman yung ibang samples na pinapadala nila, sputum na. So, it's not a swab. And we can still process them with the PCR. So it would be a very good adaptation, lalo na in cases where yung problem nila is either kulang sila ng medtech na magsaswab or wala na silang sterile swabs.
Or at
Kailangan
least
kasi,
hindi na-expose yung tao, di ba? Safer
yeah,
din
for
for the
sure.
at least wala na siya doon. Laway na
Yeah,
lang.
yeah.
Yes. I thought I saw a question by Dr. June Ruiz. Ayan. Hi, Dr. Anna and MB Joshua. Ang ganda naman ng title, MB Joshua. Great discussion. Dr. Antonio Dance and his group from UP and PISMID in a summary said that the specificity of more than 90%, 95%, but the sensitivity is only 50%. In this situation, it won't be a good screening test. Does Dr. Joshua agree with this review? Review of what? Specificity. Hindi ko nakuha yung tanong. Great discussion. Dr. Tony Dance and UPNP Smith said the specificity of more than, baka antigen yung sinasabi niya, but the
I'm not
sensitivity is
sure
only,
din.
sandali Dr. June, maybe he's listening. Pakilinaw lang kung ano yung test na tinatanong mo sa amin. Tama ba ako? The test is not, mentioned.
Yeah,
Not,
I'm not sure din pa what kind of test.
Dr. June, please put what kind of test? I'm
Okay.
suspecting antigen yung, about pooled testing. It may not be helpful in high prevalence areas like Metro Manila. And that the ARCS plans to use this in Makati soon with the help of Mayor Binay. Sandali lang, no politicians dito. Science lang, okay? But anyway, ang tinatanong niya is pooled testing. Paano daw siya in a high prevalence area? Ayan.
Yeah.
And it's
So
Metro Manila, a high prevalence area.
yeah, kasi we know for sure that Metro Manila is the hotspot in the country, diba? It's one of the major hotspots. And like we said, we observe na lately yung positivity rate or yung percent na nagpo-positive sa mga tinetest, it's I think mas malapit na nga sa 15% than 10%, which is very alarming, no? And it's also too high para gamitin ng pool testing. So if you look at published studies, actually yung recommended nila is something like 2% lang yung positivity rate or 5% mataas na. So paano pa yung 10%, diba? It's gonna be totally cost ineffective. So
Yung
not
ulitin
really what
lahat.
we do.
Oo.
Yeah.
Yeah, so not recommended talaga pag mataas ang high prevalence. And unfortunately, sa Metro Manila, mataas ang prevalence. Yun.
Yeah.
Yun yung sagot na ni MB Joshua. Ang ganda ng title, I like that. MB Joshua. Yan. So, true. And if you really choose the ones na high probability ang tinetest mo, like very symptomatic clinically, mas talagang magiging maraming positive mang makukuha mo. Kasi you're not naman testing people na nakatayo lang sa tabi. You're really choosing the pool. So sige, next question po. From Marcelo, can rapid antibody tests be used to clear a person after infection?
So I think this was already mentioned na it's not the test that we use to clear the person. It's the time. So it's have you completed yung 14 days or yung 10 plus 3 na rule na clinically okay na yung patient. So we have to, yeah.
Sige, go,
Um
Joshua, and then I'll
kasi
answer
yung
this.
yung rapid tests nga kasi, even if they look for antibodies supposedly, mismo yung rapid tests, hindi nga sila reliable. It's worse than a coin toss, basically. Kasi minsan
That's
less than 50% yung accuracy, no? So you might as well toss a coin kung
mura
may
pa.
okay ba yung patient.
Piso
Or
lang
wala,
yun.
yeah, mas mura pa. And from another, for example, from a more scientific standpoint, the presence of an antibody does not always indicate recovery, no? And recovery is not confined to the presence of antibodies alone. So, merong patients who recover but they don't have a lot of antibodies. Pwedeng yung T-cell response nila yung mas malakas. And there are patients na they produce lots of antibodies pero it's not actually enough to help them recover kasi
Hindi ka na
non-neutralizing
matutuwa.
naman
Oo.
yung antibodies that they produce. So it's not as simple as antibody equals recovery.
Napakaganda ng sinabi mong yon. Can you repeat it? Antibody do not equal recovery. Can you expound on it a little more? I like that.
Yeah.
Sige pa.
Yeah. So
Para
actually
oo.
one thing that's been discovered in COVID is that and I think this goes for other human coronaviruses is that yung antibody response it's not always as robust. So for sure may patients who will develop a robust antibody response, but mayroon din patients who do not. And it's been observed na minsan yung titers of the antibody or yung amount of antibody in the blood disappears or it wanes after a few weeks or months. So what does it doesn't mean naman na nawawala yung immunity or it doesn't mean na susceptible na ulit yung patient. Kasi we have to remember, antibodies, the antibody response is only one aspect of the whole human immune response. And there are many more aspects involved. Like, for example, T cell biology, so the T cell response. And we know naman na for viruses, particularly, important rin yung role ng T cells, which is why, again, recovery is it's not all about the antibody. No, it's not just testing for an antibody.
At saka sorry dadagdagan ko lang. Kasi, ito nangyari sa amin somebody became rapid positive. And then, after 2 weeks, rapid positive pa. So, ang ano kasi, if you have antibodies, you're never gonna clear that. Talaga antibody kayo because you
Yeah,
may really have gotten COVID. So, if you are expecting your rapid to become negative, you're gonna be quarantined forever.
yeah,
Kasi your rapid is positive. I mean, assuming, let's say even your Eclia or your ELISA, kasi nga nagka-COVID ka, magiging positive talaga yun. That's something that people don't understand kasi someone called me up saying, Mom, after 3 weeks, positive pa rin ho yung antibody ko. Siyempre, nagka-COVID ka eh.
yeah,
Antibody
yeah,
is gonna be positive.
yeah. So this is what we call the zero status, right? Or the zero conversion. And for a lot of diseases naman talaga, once you zero converted or once you have the antibodies in your blood, you will have those for life. Kasi yun yung purpose of the antibody, right? Is to part siya ng surveillance para if ever dumating ulit yung COVID, ma-attack niya agad. So that's why dapat hindi talaga mawawala yung antibodies. Kasi
That's
nga,
why
yun yung,
it's
yeah,
green.
it's supposed to stay there. But and
Yeah.
again, we already know nga na minsan nawawala yung antibodies, minsan hindi. And it's not just all about antibodies. So there
Meron
is a
ding
lot,
T cells and others.
lot
Other
more to
cells that
think about.
will
Yeah.
keep you safe despite a
Yeah.
low antibody titer. Ganon. It doesn't mean you're gonna get COVID again.
Yeah.
One question, marami nagtatanong sa akin, can you get COVID twice? My answer is always no. At least it has never been proven. Is that is molecular biology helping to answer that question also?
Mm.
I don't know kung
So
dapat sa'yo yung tanong yon. Oo.
actually, there is, syempre, ito yung isa sa big areas of research. And for now, as far as we can tell from the studies so far, parang hindi.
Ayun na nga,
Kasi
di
nga,
ba?
um, uh, it's likely na yung nag-PCR positive daw ulit after getting a negative result. That was just, again, viral remnants or viral residues that were getting picked up. But as far as we know, wala pang proven talaga that this person was infected twice. But again, this is a new virus,
Maraming
and
pwede mangyari.
it's too early to say kasi this virus has only been around since the end of December, you know. Malay natin, immunity will only last 1 or 2 years, in which case, it's too early to tell
Pwede
kasi
mag-expect.
a few years from now lang natin malalaman.
So, MB Joshua, people, kasi I have this pamangkin who got, I actually have two pamangkins who got COVID. But what I advise them is, despite having antibodies, sungot pa rin sila ng mask kasi hindi natin
Yes,
alam ano mangyayari.
yes,
Tama
for
ba?
sure. So, yeah,
Yes.
ito rin actually yung one of the things we want to avoid with antibody tests is we don't want people to walk around thinking na, nagka-COVID na pala ako or immune na pala ako. So,
And
again,
hindi mahirap.
hindi pa to proven, you know. For example, yung other human coronaviruses, yung common cold coronaviruses, we know for sure that nag-reinfect yan kasi sinisipon tayo halos every year. Diba? So, ang immunity dun sa common coronaviruses na yun, they will only last about a year or so before disappearing. You have other viruses naman na yes, once na-infect ka, you will be immune for life. But then you have viruses like dengue na your first
Or,
infection
oh,
might you might survive, but if you get infected again, you could get a worse reinfection, and all any of that could be possible. And again, yung take home message here is it's a new virus and there is a lot that
wala pang
we don't
guarantee.
know.
Yes.
Yeah,
So,
so
basically, mask pa rin.
yeah, the best is to
Mask
stick
pa
to
rin.
the public health protocols that are being put in place.
Yes. And just because you had COVID doesn't mean you should go around and not follow the IATF. Okay, guys? Hindi pwede mag-inuman dyan sa tabi-tabi dahil lahat kayo nagkaroon na ng COVID. Actually,
Yeah.
yan ang nangyayari sa Europe ngayon, and I'm really worried about that. Kasi yung mga batang nagka-COVID, parang they want to get together. Ganon. No, okay, no. Mask pa rin. Mask pa rin. Another, sige, from Marife, will the antibody be useful to confirm if the COVID patient is no longer contagious after the 14 days of quarantine?
Yeah.
Ako
So
nagsasagot, Ma'am Marifer, wala pong relationship. Um, yung antibody test po has nothing to do with infectivity. Okay? It's not related. So, do not do the antibody test to find out if that person can go around after 14 days. If the person had mild COVID or moderate COVID and it's no fever na po after walang paracetamol, feeling okay, 3 araw na pong okay, pwede na pong lumabas yon, no rapid antibody testing. My question na lang sa mga fans of antibody testing, pakisabi lang Joshua kung saan ba talaga dapat gamitin yon at gustong-gusto nilang gamitin.
so actually useful lang ang antibody tests for probably for epidemiologists. Kasi one question that they would be interested to answer is ilan na yung nagka-COVID in the population.
Yes.
So this is useful for epidemiologists kasi it will affect yung mathematical models nila, it can affect yung policies that will be set by the IATF kanon. But this is not diagnostic testing. So actually if they do this in other countries, kukuhanin ka ng dugo pero walang babalik sa'yo na result. Kasi
Ah,
in-enroll ka, yeah, you're just enrolled in the study, pero you will not necessarily be told if you were antibody positive or negative. Kasi probably it's part either the study design or the ethics of the study, or you know they're worried na people will become overconfident, they will think they're immune. So this is not as simple as yung mga tao magda-drive through, magpapa-rapid test or magpapa even ECLIA or ELISA test for antibodies. There will be a sampling methodology and there's a proper way to go about it na it's really a zero survey or an epidemiological study. And doon nagagamit yung antibody tests, specifically yung ELISA tests or ECLIA tests. Even rapid antibody tests won't be used for something like that. Pero for all other purposes, like is it whether it's screening or clearance, or you wanna determine if parang nagka-COVID na ba ako before, not we don't really recommend any of those. Or actually, di talaga dapat sila ginagawa.
Hindi pa sila daw. Except under an epidemiologic study. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I guess meron pa if you want to donate your plasma. Tama ba ako? Hanggang doon na
Yeah.
lang.
Actually, I think that's one of it is minsan naghahanap kasi ng recovered, but actually pag ganun, it's still safer to get from someone na talagang confirmed na COVID and then nag-recover, because antibody tests, even ELISA, mas prone yan sa false positive talaga, lalo na compared to your PCR, kasi antibodies they, lalo na pag sa lab na, they can be quite sticky. To speak casually, parang they're not always as, kumbaga, kahit na specific nga yung antibody from your body or from your blood, yun namang antigen niya sa rapid test or sa ELISA test, it's not as specific all the time. So it's very prone to getting false positive sa antibody test, which is why,
Kahit Leah and Eliza. Meron
yeah,
din.
I mean, much less, pero still possible. So
I
again,
thought, yes. Sige.
yeah, it shouldn't be a reason to be confident, or it shouldn't be taken as a sign of immunity.
Wag kayong lalabas na walang mask, basically. From Attorney Panlilio, ito maganda to. What is the difference between the COVID test developed by UP and the PCR widely used at present? Because I was going to ask you, what happened to the UP test kit and how is it different?
So actually, is it different? In technically speaking, wala siyang difference from the regular PCR kits that we import. It's the same. They're all the same na PCR kits. Yung differences niyan, very nasa technical side na talaga. Yung main advantage niya is that it's locally assembled kasi. Locally, dito siya ginagawa. So,
Dito.
for sure, we save, I mean, it's the same, pero since dito siya ginagawa, we save a lot of costs compared to importing yung test kits mismo. So that's the main factor, I think, is it's cheaper. Um, and after nila, I think a few months ago, it was reported kasi na they had technical issues with the test kits, but those issues have been resolved since, according to DOH. So those kits should really be good to use. But I think kasi rin merong parang misconception na mas mabilis daw, or na parang this kit can return results in 2 hours, parang gano'n. Lahat naman po kasi ng PCR, they will take 2 hours yung PCR mismo. So it's the same. Kumbaga nag-switch ka lang ng ingredient sa recipe, pero
So
they're all the same.
this is not a rapid PCR, yung ano, this
Yeah,
is a
it's
regular
not.
PCR kit.
Yeah, it's a conventional PCR.
One question lang, since we dove straight into testing, can you please tell us about yung kasama mong Scientists Unite Against
Uh,
COVID-19? Yes. And
yeah,
please tell us how you started. Yun, kwento nyo. I mean, what are you guys doing? I
yeah,
heard you helped the DOH. Yun.
yeah.
Can you
So
can let us know?
So, Scientists Unite Against COVID-19. We are a group of young scientists and other people. Not everyone is a scientist. Now, we are working together to advocate for mass testing, and basically for the improvement of the testing capacity in the country. So, the story is it's really just at the beginning it was just a few colleagues who banded together, ganon. Kasi what we realized was that kasi kulang na kulang yung testing, lalo na
Oo naman.
before. Yeah, I mean ngayon kulang na kulang pa rin, pero
Ano pa rin?
even more in the early days talaga. And actually what we realized at first was that um dapat magagawan to ng paraan. Kasi for example, yung PCR machines na kailangan sa testing, meron kami niyan sa lab, or sa building namin siguro may 3 ganyan. So wala namang gumagamit. Kasi nga, ECQ, so walang pasok, right? And it's not just us. For sure, there are several labs around the country who actually have those machines, and they have the people who are trained. like us to use those machines, no? So realized na, I think this was mentioned earlier na, parang ang hirap mag-set up ng PCR, no? And ang daming requirements, ang daming kailangan. But it's a solvable issue. It's not it's not an end of the world issue. Kasi nga, for example, yun, in a pinch, one of the things we did was nag-survey kami ng labs who were willing to loan their equipment, and then we forwarded that list to DOH, and then we were able to survey for volunteer molecular biologists, volunteer scientists na willing mag-volunteer muna sa testing labs. So we volunteered ourselves also to do
Wow.
the PCRs at testing labs. And so yun yung mindset namin at first, no, is that it's definitely a solvable issue na kulang sa gamit, kulang sa tao, pero kulang sa supplies. Pero, these are all issues na we should know how to handle. Lalo na, lalo na if like you have more resources, diba? For sure, these are issues that you can address. And then, as we went along, we really realized na not only do we need that yung mismong problem of logistics, there's also a big information uh, problem, kumbaga, or there's a very pressing need for awareness and for campaign. Kasi a lot of people, yun nga, nagkakaroon ng confusions about antibody testing, about PCR testing. Like, there were a lot, for example, there were questions like, if I'm asymptomatic, does that mean na I'm not contagious? Ganon. So there were a lot of questions like that, no? And of course, we decided na, syempre, I think one thing we can contribute during this pandemic is that as scientists, we
Knowledge.
can help, diba? We can help educate people on the topic. Kasi I personally think na one of the most important things for everyone in this pandemic is to be informed and to be equipped with the right knowledge, no? Kasi for example, if you had like the right knowledge na ganito pala nagsispread yung COVID, and ganito pala yung symptoms, ganito pala yung precautions that I have to take, then everyone would be much more likely to comply with the rules that are being imposed, no? Like if naintindihan ng mga tao na this is why kailangan ng mask, this is why kailangan ng testing, this is why kailangan ng social distancing. So one of the things that we took on is we try to help address yung needs for educating people.
Yeah. Okay, so that's the scientist. One question again. Sorry, sir. Sorry, ako muna. Masyado na ako interested talaga. This is like one of the most interesting talks. How about yung mga sinasabi nilang different strains of COVID?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Um, is that also one of the things that a molecular biologist would know about?
Yeah.
Kasi 'di ba issues
So,
na mga merong hindi na daw nanggaling ng
mm-hmm.
China, meron na
Mm-hmm.
daw galing na ibang lugar.
Mm-hmm.
Can you tell us about this?
Yeah.
And how do we know this kung saan ba galing ito? Oo.
Yeah. So,
Kasi may naawit sila na dapat binan daw lahat ng mga tiga-China.
uh,
Pero naman nagsabi, hindi naman po tiga-China na yung mga strains.
mm-hmm.
So,
Mm-hmm.
can you, what are these strains? Are they
Yeah.
more, what I heard is that they are more infectious but less
Mm-hmm.
deadly, kaya konti lang daw ang namamatay.
Mm-hmm.
Please help us.
Mm-hmm. So actually, one of the this is part of what molecular biologists know, kasi the way that we determine yung viral strains, or kung nag-evolve na ba yung virus or mayroon bang iba-ibang version ng virus, is mainly through sequencing, or we take the genetic sequence of the virus. So minsan yung mga taong sinaswab, kinukuha yung samples niyan so that we can sequence the virus. And this is where we might know if, for example, nagkaroon ba ng strains or whatever. And meron kasing, yung word kasi na strain, or the term itself, it can be a little vague. So, for example, some people say strain to refer to any variant or any variations. Basta may difference sa different strain. And if yun yung usapan, naturally, marami talagang strains. Kasi viruses, they evolve
God.
relatively quickly. No? So, even within one person, for example, by the end of the infection, nag-diversify na yung viral strains in the body. And some people use the term strain to refer to specifically yung virus nagkaroon ng change that has biological consequences, or it actually affects something about the virus. Like, kasi not all mutations or not all changes in the genetic sequence are consequential or functional. There are a lot of mutations that just don't do anything. And
They
this,
just
that's a
happen.
general rule. Yeah. So some mutations are good, some mutations are bad. Most mutations might not even do anything. So a strain in a virus might make it more or less infectious. It might make the disease more or less severe. So if you ever played the game na Plague or yung Plague Inc. or something like that, the strain really changes something about the virus, the way it works. So this is where nagkakatalo kasi as far as we know, overall, firstly, overall, yung coronavirus that we have now, it hasn't evolved a lot. It's basically still the same all over the world. And probably good for us because we don't have to worry about the vaccines that we're designing. And the reason for this is number one, it's only been a few months. And number two, yung coronaviruses kasi by nature, mas mabagal talaga sila mag-evolve compared to
Or
other
it's like
viruses.
flu.
Yeah. But
Yearly.
yung nasa news lately was that meron daw more infectious strain. This is called the G614 variant. So originally kasi yung original or wild type strain is the D or dog as in letter D na variant. And then ngayon may nag-arise na G variant. And you see see G614, this was observed to be more infectious now, but only so far in cell culture. So meaning, in the lab, nung tinignan yung virus, it sticks better to the cells. Ganun. Although, syempre yung mismo experiments na yun, marami pang questions about that. It's very, very far from being conclusive na it's actually a new strain that is more infectious. Overall, what we know for sure is that we haven't observed any difference in the severity of the disease. So it's still the same. Now, a lot of people might be asymptomatic, a lot of people will be mild, but some people will go on to develop pneumonia, will go on to have ARDS, or some people will die. Yeah. So this new strain does not, as far as we know, doesn't actually change the severity of the disease. And we don't actually even know if, kasi there were claims na kaya daw nagkaroon tayo ng more cases or surge of cases was because nag-evolve daw yung virus or because of this new strain. But that's actually not true as far as we know. Now, the reason na we have a lot of cases is because we failed in our earlier containment strategies. There's no easy way to say it. No, we just haven't been doing enough.
People just keep
But
eating together. Okay, sige.
yeah, 'di ba? Wala pa kasing hindi pa natin na-observe na bumababa yung graph of cases, which is very sad for us. But it's not because of a new strain or anything like that. And even if this was a new strain, let's say for the sake of argument that it was more infectious, how would it affect us? Nothing will change about the things we do. No, it will still be the same. You have to wear a mask, you have to do physical distancing, you have to avoid yung closed, poorly ventilated spaces, and so on. It doesn't actually change yung public health interventions.
Doesn't matter kung ano strange, sumot ka ng
Yeah,
mask.
yeah. And there are preliminary studies now on other strains, different strains na baka totoong strain talaga. But again, nothing conclusive for now. For sure, kapag may na-discover talaga na something has changed, you will know about it, and it will
May
be
headline siya.
headline news. Yeah. Pero for now, even the Philippine Genome Center has said in their statement na as far as we know, there is no evidence really to say na this new strain or ako personally, I don't like calling it a strain. Let's just call it a variant. Kasi
Oo.
it's just a change, no? Pero as far as we know, it doesn't really do anything significant yet to the virus or to the disease.
Question, MB Joshua, alam ba natin where the virus came from? Like France, Europe? May mga ganun ba? Or nobody can
Uh,
answer that question?
so we can trace that through genomics, through the sequencing of the virus. Kasi there's an international database where scientists from all over the world deposit the sequences of the viral samples in their country, in their location, And then tayo, pwede rin tayong mag-deposit ng sa atin and pwede nating i-compare saan nanggagaling yung viruses. So, ito yung studies na ginagawa sa Philippine Genome Center and I think meron din sa RITM. And from what we can tell so far, it's that first of all, I think yung one of the major conclusions is that maraming possible introductions. So it didn't just come from one place and then spread everywhere. There were probably, introductions from China, from Europe, from the United States. Because it's a pandemic, no? So it became widespread. So for sure, sequencing can help us determine yung lineage of the virus, like where did it come from, how is it spreading in the community.
Regardless kung saan siya nanggaling, nandito na siya.
Yeah,
Wear a
yeah.
mask. Okay. So, thank you. Kasi talagang ang daming tanong, ang dami talaga. Ako man mismo, I'm really so interested. What is the most common, from Mr. Angelito, what is the most common RNA extraction method ang ginagamit sa public testing center? And does this matter? Hindi ko alam.
Mhm. Yeah,
I'm not
so
a scientist po at hindi rin po ako medtech. So, tinatanong ko lang.
it matters usually for the supplies kasi may methods na each method usually means sariling supplies na kailangan. And some methods are faster, some methods are longer. One of the most common is we use spin columns. So spin columns. Others meron silang crude extractions. So meron kasing certain brands na yung ginagamit nilang RNA extraction is not the real RNA extraction. It's a crude method. So parang approximate lang. And it's faster, pero it might sacrifice the sensitivity of the test. Kasi crude lang. So hindi pa siya pure RNA. And then some people use magnetic beads. Some labs, yung mga mas well-equipped, they have automated extractors which syempre it helps relieve yung need for medtechs or you will need less people, but again those are probably for yung mas social, so not likely to have it in a public testing center.
Ayan. Okay. So, Miss Rain, yan. So, basically, more or less, no matter what extraction method, okay naman siya. It's not too
Yeah.
bad. Ay nako, from Miss Elaine, why daw are they doing antibody? Because the company requires. Ma'am, yan po talaga, ako na lang ho ang sasagot at hindi na po si MB Joshua. Mag-usap po kayo ng company at i-review nyo po yung DOH guidelines kung nakakatulong pa ho sa kumpanya yon. I'm sorry, but there are really some companies still not doing the advisory. So, pabasa nyo na lang po. That's the best thing that I can tell you po. And then, pabasa nyo rin po yung sinabi po ng DTI, ma'am. Marami na hong nag-evolve talaga. Well, actually po, it has been said since May. Wala lang hong masyadong nakikinig. But please read the guidelines and please advise that company. From Jam, do you develop resistance from COVID after being infected and for how long? And any recommendation for people with asthma? Ako na muna ang sasagot sa people with asthma. If you really are an asthmatic person and you're coughing, ang dapat po sa inyo talaga is stay at home. Kasi po, when you do the health declaration, ang tanong, kayo po ba'y nahihirapan na huminga? If you check yes, punta ka na ng ER. So if you know that it's asthma and matagal na rin ho kayo mang-asthma, I'm sorry, you really have to tell your job na dapat work from home muna. Second issue that you should do is consult po your pulmonologist. Kasi there are people with emphysema, bronchitis who have been tested like 5 to 10 times. Hindi ho dapat ganun. Kasi talagang inuubo ho kayo, the answer is yes. Okay, so wala na, testing na yon. Sige, let's ask. I guess he was asking, does it confer immunity? And I guess what you said is sige, short version na lang since nasagot na rin.
Yeah. Yeah, so like we said earlier, it probably does. We have seen naman na there is an immune response, but how long does it last, or does it last forever? We don't know yet, and we don't know yet.
And what I tell people is you do not want to be the first person with 2 COVIDs, okay? So wear a mask.
Yeah.
Well, sisikat kayo, but again, what about certain cases like yung kay General Anyo na nagkasakit daw siya twice, and then some others, baka, ito lang other is lingering COVID. Baka akala po ng mga tao gumaling sila. Pero actually, low-lying lang. And then, this is a very tricky disease po eh. There are some areas na akala nyo po gumaling na kayo. You might have been swabbed and then it was negative. So you think you're okay. And then biglang magka-crash po kayo. And that is still part of the original illness. Marami pong ganong kwento from Wuhan and I read a lot of that during the early parts. So very tricky po talaga as a clinician, very tricky po. We might be thinking na kuminsan parang gagaling ng konti yung tao then biglang hindi na naman eh. So yun po yung that might be, I don't want to mention any names because it's all very sad. But lingering illness of COVID po occurs. So if you had the serious kind, you really need to be checked po by a pulmonologist. Hindi po kayo pwede dun sa time-based strategy. Okay? So next po, next question. Yan na ba yun, Miss Rains? Ang dami, inulan ka ng tanong, mostly from me.
Okay po tayo, Doktora. Madami pong tanong. Ang dami po
Buwan ka pa ba, MB Joshua? Are you okay? Do you wanna drink water?
Okay pa naman po.
Yan ang benefits, Reyna. Yan ang pag bata pa yung guest mo. Pag kasing edad mo na ako, hindi mo na kaya. Okay.
Naku, ang dami nila talagang tanong. Like, let me flash some more of the questions here on our comment section.
MB Joshua, short na lang ha, kasi talagang hindi tayo matatapos nito. Yan. From Mr. Joey, what test would you request if a patient with signs and symptoms of COVID will consult you on the 10th or 14th day of illness? I would send him to the ER and to a pulmonologist po. That's what I would do. Kasi po, baka, are you sure na COVID po yan? And baka naman magkaroon pa ng ibang disease on top of the COVID. So ako nasasagot doon. If someone had signs and symptoms of COVID, that person should not be time or based or symptom based cleared. Okay? Kung inuubo pa po on day 14, punta na po sa ospital at magpa-check up pa uli. Okay? Next. From Jam, do you develop resistance from COVID after being infected? Ay, sinagot na po ito. Yes, Miss Rain. From Vimro, ang COVID po ay fragile. Bakit nagiging contagious? Virus po siya and all viruses are contagious. Well, most viruses are contagious. Ayan po. Okay, next. Thank you, Vimro. From Joey. Next, at natanong na ito, si Joey. From Marilyn, thanks Doc Anna and Sir Josh. Well explained. Thanks, Mom. From Joey, okay. Isn't it that the RT-PCR has low sensitivity and specificity after the 8th day? Totoo ba? Yes, I think the answer is yes. But sige,
yeah, so I don't know the exact details, but specificity, it doesn't really go down. Because again, it's a very specific test. It's one of the most specific tests you can have. So specificity is about false positives. No? And sa PCR, it's very, very unlikely to get a false positive. Yung sensitivity, yes, merong observations na the sensitivity declines kasi by this time, pababa na yung viral load. But again, if...
Tama ba ako? That's what I told people.
Yeah, but if you're on the 8th day of your illness, probably dapat matagal ka nang na-test way before that. It's a bit late to be testing you.
Why was pooled testing allowed by the DOH? Will not this affect the results? I think we need to ask this to the DOH. Hindi po kami ang DOH. But again, as Dr. Joshua said, MB Joshua said, pooled testing works best pag mababa lang po yung positive rate natin. Tama ba ako, MB Joshua? Yes. From Dr. June, sorry, nakalimutan kong ilagay antigen testing. Okay. Antigen testing, pooled antigen testing ata yung sagot ni Dr. June. I think sinagot na rin. From Mark, hello Doc and Sir Josh. Ask ko lang po yung virus that is responsible for cough and colds kahit wala pang COVID pandemic. I member po ng coronavirus family or ibang viruses. He's asking about the common cold.
Merong common cold.
Na baka daw mag-cross-react. Totoo ba yun?
For sure po, sa antibody tests, it's possible to get a false positive, pero hindi galing sa COVID, galing sa other coronaviruses. For the question itself, yes, mayroong common cold coronavirus, but not all colds are from coronaviruses. There are also other viruses that can give you coughs or colds.
And the PCR is highly specific, right? Uh,
Yeah.
so if the PCR is positive, that is not a common cold.
Yeah, for
That's
sure.
good.
Dinidesign yung PCR tests ngayon na it won't catch even the other coronavirus. I think yung possible lang na mag-cross-react sa PCR would be SARS, but then wala naman kasing SARS
Wala
ngayon.
namang SARS
So,
ngayon.
yeah.
Mukha tayo malungkot pag nagka-SARS
Yeah.
pa. From Orly, why is the latest doctor who died was infected twice? Um, Sir Orly, ako yung sumagot nito na it's possible. I don't know if she was infected twice. And again, wala po ako sa PGH. I do not want to be the one to answer this. Siguro po, let's wait for the report po from PGH if it's really a totally different PCR first and second. Tama ba ako? Let's wait na lang po for PGH to give
Yeah.
us that. Mahirap pong mag-speculate dahil hindi po kami ang doktor niya. Sorry, Doc and Sir, madami lang pong tanong. What causes a virus to mutate? What causes a virus ba? Ang alam ko merong
Mutation
antigenic
is
shock.
actually
Oh.
yeah. Yeah, it's actually natural. It's a natural process, not just for viruses, no, but for all living things. Na they will eventually nagmutate in their genes after some time. And for viruses, one of the most powerful kasi is because mabilis sila mag-reproduce, no? So and they're not
Tama
like, for
naman.
example, mabilis yung generations. Mabilis din. It appears faster to us na nagkakaroon sila ng mutations. That's kasi, they're much simpler and smaller. So, mas madali talaga sila mag-evolve.
Okay. Ang daming tanong. Grabe, Joshua. From Disha, which test can be useful if not the rapid test? Sir, I think sinagot na po natin to. At sa akin number one test is common sense and critical thinking. Unfortunately, hindi po yun nabibili. So, health declaration, social distancing, mask, face shield. Kung may symptoms po and known exposure, pa-PCR po kayo. Okay? Tama ba ako, MB Joshua? Yon. Nothing will no test can replace common sense po and critical thinking. Kasi if you don't think first and you just test everyone, mababacklog din po yung testing. Okay? So next, from Mr. Maynardo, Joshua, dugo ang kunin sa rapid test. Yes, sir. Opo, dugo po sa rapid antibody serology testing. From Myla, good PM po, Doctora and Doc. You said that the rapid test is inaccurate. If the person had the rapid test, IgG, positive, indicative po ba siya ng ibang infeksyon? Sinabi, parang my answer to this is it's possible, di ba? You said it's possible to cross-react.
Yeah, well, if it's a rapid test, diba, it's as good as a coin toss na. It might be COVID, it might be something else, it might be nothing. So, again, kung rapid antibody test lang yun, it's
Who knows?
almost worthless. Yeah.
Anything could happen. Question, yung rapid test ho ba, MB Joshua, yun ba yung meron ako nakita, positive or negative lang? And then there's some tests na may IgM and IgG pa raw.
Yeah, but
So,
those are, they can both be rapid tests.
They
Basta
can
yung
both be
mukhang pregnancy test, yung lateral flow.
All right. Next. This must be aired on TV news. That's good. Tama po. From Agnes, MB Josh. O talagang MB na yung title. Yun ba talaga ang title ng mga MB?
Hindi pa.
Yun yung bagong title nito. MB Josh. I really like it. MB Josh. We have to thank Dr. June Ruiz. You title yourself ngayon, MB Josh. Joshua Miguel. No, it's very nice actually. It's very helpful. MB Josh, what is your opinion on the case of Dr. Kat Senen? Sa akin po, I don't want to comment, especially since someone just passed away. Let's wait na lang po for PGH to let us know po kung ano ba talaga ang nangyari. Are you in agreement with that, Joshua, MB Josh?
Yeah.
Oo, wala po kasi kami doon. Mahirap po kaming magsalita. Sa QRT-PCR test ng mga public testing, ano po ang load ng virus to say na positive po sila? Is there a certain load o basta makakita ka ng isa, positive na yon?
Yeah, technically po kasi, and whether public or private naman, it really depends on the test kit. So most test kits will say na yung cutoff nila is 40 kasi there's a number called the CP number na binibigay ng PCR. Tapos kapag less than 40, yun yung positive. So, yun yung, to be technical about it, that's the cutoff, the most common cutoff na ginagamit. But then, it's as good as saying na basta meron. And we're not super concerned right now with the amount or with the viral
Basta
load.
meron kang isang COVID, may COVID ka na sa akin From Rose, hello, I am watching from Sorsogon. Effective ba to kill? Ma'am, ako nang sasagot niyan. That's not a molecular biologist concern. Yung UV sterilizer, meron po. But be careful because there are lots of fake coming out. Ayan. From June, ayan. From Dr. Tori Dance, reportedly based on the review that the sensitivity of an antigen test is only 50% and specificity is 95. Reliable ba ito? Is this
Yeah,
a reliable?
so again, yeah, definitely it's if those are the values, no, it's not reliable enough. Kasi kung sensitivity 50%, that means half of the negatives would be false negatives, no, or you would miss half of the true cases, which is very
Again,
bad.
Costco na naman yun.
Yeah,
Kasi
but I think I'd like to emphasize lang siguro na kasi madalas to naririnig na ano yung sensitivity ng antibody test or ng PCR test. But remember, this will change from brand to brand. So it's not the case na lahat ng antigen test the same or lahat ng antibody test the same. Iba-iba yan per brand. So you would have to ask not just what type of test, but the specific brand na ginagamit. And then ano na yung data niya.
yes. And regardless of the brand, an antibody test should not be used for screening, okay? From Tessie,
Yes.
bakit po yung asawa ng nag-positive na first and second rapid IgM and IgG positive but negative sa swab? Bakit ganun po? Because hindi po dapat gamitin ang rapid antibody. Okay? So, ang nangyari po sa inyo na false positive po kayo. Okay.
Doctora, that's the
So
end of
that's it. Just go, MB Joshua, I'm so sorry. I only told you 1 hour. But anyway, they know you're young and that you can survive a 2 hour questioning. At hindi namin kaya yon. But really, honestly, this has been one of the best talks that we ever had. And I'm really happy rin na marami rin kami. I mean, marami sa amin na clinicians eh. It helps us to find out the science behind what we're really telling people. Kasi baka mali eh. We're happy to know na parang nasa tama naman kami kahit papano. I mean, we are not molecular biologists, but iba yung alam namin, which is the view naman of a clinician. Pero definitely, at least it helps us to review the science, to hear the science from a real scientist. Well, scientists din naman kami, but more of clinicians. So,
Yeah.
to MB Josh, more power to the scientists unite against COVID-19. You are very young but already a health activist, and siguro we would like to pugayan kayong lahat for no, kasi you know, you could just be very comfortable but you stepped out and tumulong talaga sa Pilipinas during this COVID crisis. Please continue to inform us. We will invite you again, sinasabi ko na, the scientists vaccines. Vaccines po, baka 3 hours yun, Diyos ko. Kumain
Actually, yeah,
ako ng
it is a
CR.
very
Okay?
hot topic
Yan.
kasi ngayon.
So,
So for sure.
yan. Salamat po to MB Josh and thank you very much for joining us. So, the only reason I was able to abuse this young scientist is because he's my inaanak. And
no problem naman.
I would like to just go, matanda na ako, save me. I would like to greet his parents, Dr. Alfonso Dana, the head of operations po and at JBL Hospital. And of course, one of the best OB-GYNs in Pampanga is Dr. Emmy Cristobal Dana. So, marami hong mga friends ni Josh, babatiin na lang natin later. Kasi wala na tayo ng oras. Your friends, your cousins, Joshua, are very proud of you. Okay?
Thank you
A
po.
few
Thank you
words
po.
na lang of hope sa mga, can you encourage young people that, of course, we know MBB is a difficult course. Can you encourage, kasi I think we need more scientists. Ayan, last words na lang
Yeah,
of encouragement. Ayan.
I think for sure, one of the things that personally na-realize ko after during COVID was that we definitely need more scientists in the country, no, and I think ngayon it's times like these na I mean dati pa naman no, pero times like these talaga you will be forced to confront that reality no na kulang tayo sa 'di ba kulang tayo sa doctors, nurses, kulang din tayo sa scientists, no, and na, if you ever had like a time na we consider like when would be a good time to go into science or medicine, I think now is a good time, no? Consider that kasi suddenly no, yung parang dati naririnig mo lang sa lecture or nabasa mo lang sa libro, it's now real, no? It's na real work. Dati yung PCR experiment lang yun for thesis, gano'n, grade para graduate. Tapos ngayon, it's actually something that is very, very socially important and relevant in our current situation. So, um, and siguro just to close, I'd invite na lang na if you have a lot, I'm sure there are a lot more questions or things that you might be curious about. So we have a Facebook page, Scientists Unite Against COVID-19. We post a lot of infographics, mga frequently answered questions, or mga, you know, mga common topics na pinag-uusapan. So a lot of the things we talked about here, we talk about PCR testing, antibody testing, and all that. And recently, meron kaming videos on the page. So if you don't want to read and you prefer the video, there are videos about antibody tests, about PCR tests, yung sinabi ko about the labs and the consumables. I think there's a video na about vaccines. So you can check out yung page. Hopefully, some of your questions can be answered there. And I hope you can support us by helping us advocate no for an improvement in the COVID testing in the country. No? Kasi like I said earlier, it's difficult for sure. Maraming kailangan, but it's not an impossible problem. Kasi whether we like it or not, maraming cases di ba? So we're definitely gonna need to be doing a lot more testing and contact tracing and the isolation and all of that. So whether we like it or not, we're gonna have to invest talaga in those things. Not just for COVID actually, but they're very good public health investment in general. No? Having PCR labs, ganun, having all the capacity. So yun lang po.
Nakulang tayo.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, COVID is just one of the many, many diseases, infectious diseases in the Philippines. No, so all of that would actually benefit from if we could strengthen yung capacity natin. So thank you po for having me on, and I hope I was able to contribute to the discussion a lot. So thank you po, and ingat po everyone.
Thank you so much, and magandang gabi po sa inyong lahat. Umabot na tayo ng gabi. I'm so proud of my inaanak. Thank you, Joshua. Salamat,
Thank you
MB
po.
Joshua.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you. Bati na lang po kami bukas.